Wealth, power, and influence. Chung My Lan had it all. She owned a multi-billion-dollar empire. From luxury real estate to major banks, her name was everywhere. With every decision she made, the future of Vietnam's economy shifted. She could save a company with a single phone call, or destroy it just as fast. Hated by some, admired by others, there will never be another woman quite like Chung My Lan. This is her story. Miss Lan was born on October 13, 1956, in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. She was of Chinese-Vietnamese descent, and even as a child, people called her a business genius. Before she built a billion-dollar empire, Miss Lan and her mother started small, selling cosmetics at Vantin market in Ho Chi Minh City. Her mother, a Chinese businesswoman, slowly built up assets over time and supported the dreams of her daughter. Together, they laid out the first stones of what would become something huge. Back then, Vietnam had a communist economy, and just like other countries with central planning, it was slow, inefficient, and didn't leave much room for private businesses. But everything changed in 1986, when the government launched economic reforms and opened the doors to private enterprise. For ambitious people like Miss Lan, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Around that same time, she met her future husband, Eric Chu. Born and raised in Hong Kong, Eric moved to Vietnam in 1987, working for a German company looking to explore the country's new, untapped market. The two met, clicked, and got married. Later in 1992, they co-founded the Vantin Fat Group, starting off in the trading business. Eric Chu had knowledge and experience in international trade, and their first big win was selling LG mobile phones from South Korea. That success gave them the capital and confidence to expand. Soon they moved into restaurants and hotels, but the real game changer came around the year 2000: real estate. Vietnam's property market was exploding. Since 1990, real estate prices had gone through the roof. A 100 square meter property bought for just $4,000 in 1990 could sell for around $900,000 by 2024. Miss Lan entered the market at exactly the right time, and she went all in. Real estate became the heart of her growing empire. By 2007, she had already built a network of companies, and they were worth billions. The Vantin Fat Group quietly expanded into a massive web of over 1,000 companies, each playing a specific role in a carefully crafted ecosystem. At the core were financial institutions, the most critical part of the entire corporation. Next came the real estate giants, luxury hotels, and restaurants. Then a network of shell companies inside Vietnam. These were tools for shifting money around, getting bank loans, and restructuring debts. And finally, the offshore shell companies based in places like the British Virgin Islands. These were to manage overseas assets and move wealth across borders quietly and efficiently. It was smart, it was complex, and it worked for a while. Banks were the heart of Miss Lan's empire. They were pumping money through every corner of her operation. But soon, those same banks would become the center of the biggest fraud scandal Vietnam has ever seen. At the core of her business empire stood the banks, quietly working as the engines of her wealth. But there was a problem. Vietnam's law on credit institutions says no single person can own more than 5% of a bank. That's to stop any one person from having too much control. So, of course, Miss Lan found a way around it. She used her family members and close associates to secretly buy up shares in 3 banks. On paper, the names were different, but behind the scenes, she controlled everything. She owned 81% of Saigon Commercial Bank, split between 32 shareholders, 99% of Tinh Gia Bank, under 36 shareholders, and 80% of Phicom Bank, under 24 shareholders. All of this was done quietly and legally. But there was another issue. These 3 small banks were struggling. By 2011, they were close to bankruptcy. To understand what happened, we need to take a quick look at how banks work. In simple terms, banks borrow and lend money. They take in deposits from the public, your savings and direct deposits and checking money, paying a small interest rate on that money, say 2%. They then lend that money out as loans to other people or companies, charging a higher rate like 7%. The difference, 5% in this case, is the bank's profit. But there's a catch. If a bank lends too much money to risky clients, and especially if those clients don't pay that money back, everything can fall apart, and quickly. And that's exactly what happened. These three banks had been lending massive amounts of money to companies controlled by Miss Lan, with no intention to pay them back. That loaned money was then used for risky real estate deals, many of which were failing or for the personal needs and whims of Miss Lan. As news spread, customers panicked and started pulling their money out. The banks were on the edge, but Miss Lan wasn't ready to let go. Instead, she came up with a bold plan. She asked the Vietnamese central bank for permission to merge all three banks into one. This would help her cover the losses and keep the money flowing to herself. Now, here's the shocking part. The central bank knew she was the real owner behind all three banks. They knew the merge would be illegal, but it was still approved. Why? Well, because Miss Lan had paid massive bribes to top officials at the central bank to turn a blind eye and let it happen. On January 1st, 2012, the three struggling banks were officially merged into one, Saigon Commercial Bank, or simply SCB. After the merger, Miss Lan tightened her grip. She now controlled 86% of SCB's shares, hidden under the names of 73 different people. By 2018, that control had grown to 91%. On paper, she didn't own the bank, but in reality, she was the bank. And she used it for one purpose: to fund herself. She funneled money from SCB into her own companies through fake loan applications, money meant for real businesses and real people now sitting in her personal accounts. But even though she secretly owned SCB, the banking sector in Vietnam is still heavily regulated. That means she couldn't just take whatever amount she wanted without raising suspicion. So she found another trick: property valuation fraud. When you apply for a big loan, the bank doesn't just hand over the money. It asks for collateral, something valuable like real estate, that the bank can take if you don't pay the loan back. But how does the bank know what that real estate is worth? Well, they hire property valuation companies, independent professionals who estimate the true market value of the property. Miss Lan bribed those companies to inflate the prices. A property worth $2 million would suddenly be valued at $10 million. That allowed her to take out much bigger loans than she should have ever qualified for. And she didn't just do this once or twice. She and her inner circle created over 2,500 fake loans at SCB, dispersing a total of $44 billion. Let that sink in. $44 billion in loans given by a bank to its own hidden owner. That wasn't just corruption, it was one of the largest financial frauds in the world's history. To put it into perspective, $44 billion was equal to 10% of Vietnam's entire GDP, and it's also 93% of SCB's total lending. This wasn't just bad banking, this was a financial earthquake. And it was just the beginning. Once the fake loans were approved and the money was in the system, Lan didn't waste any time. She gave direct orders to her team: move the funds from the borrowing companies to shell companies or fake individuals, people who didn't actually exist or had no real business operations. Whenever she needed cash, the money would be shifted between her many companies, all part of the giant Vantin fat network she controlled. And when she wanted cold, hard cash, she made it happen fast. She told SCB employees to forge documents, making it look like the cash withdrawals were legal. Once the paperwork was faked, the bank handed over massive amounts of money in cash. From February 2019 to September of 2022, her drivers delivered $4.6 billion in cash. Let that sink in. That's 46 tons of $100 bills. It would take 2 full-size semi-trucks just to carry it all. The cash was dropped off at her private residence in Ho Chi Minh City and at the Vantin Phat headquarters. It was one of the largest financial crimes the world has ever seen. And it didn't stop there. When she wanted to move money outside the country, she used another trick. She and her team created fake contracts between Vietnamese companies and offshore shell companies. These contracts claimed to be for things like buying shares, capital contributions, and company loans. But none of it was real. The companies abroad were just shells controlled by her or her closest allies. Between 2012 and 2022, she managed to smuggle out around $1.5 billion from Vietnam. Most of the documents used in these transfers were either incomplete, incorrect, or completely missing. It was all illegal. But once again, SCB executives looked the other way and approved the transfers. They allowed millions to disappear across borders, no questions asked. However, even this wasn't the full picture. Faced with billions in losses, Miss Lan crossed a line that should never be crossed. In her desperation to keep the empire afloat, she made a ruthless decision. One that would shatter lives, wipe out life savings, and leave thousands of innocent people with nothing. Before we jump into the next chapter, if you're finding this story interesting, make sure to subscribe to Dirty Digits. I dive deep into the world of financial crime, money laundering, and fraud, the stuff hidden behind polished headlines. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Alright, let's get back into it. Miss Lan became the mastermind behind a scheme that would eventually rob thousands of investors. It all started in August 2018. Things inside SCB had reached a critical point. By now, SCB was in serious trouble. The bank was running out of money because almost all of SCB's cash had been handed over to companies within Miss Lan's empire, the Vantin Phat Group. Those companies weren't paying even a scrap of it back. The loans were toxic, and SCB was suffocating under bad debt. There was no cash left to operate. No money for new loans, no way to keep up the illusion of a healthy, functioning bank. That's when Miss Lan called a private meeting. She sat down with top executives from both SCB and Vantin Phat to find a solution, a way to rescue the bank and keep everything from falling apart. But instead of fixing the problem the legal way, they came up with something else. A plan that would shift the burden of the crisis onto ordinary people, investors who trusted the system. Their idea was to raise money from the public by tricking them. They would create fake corporate bonds, investment products that looked legitimate but were built on lies. These bonds would be used to cover SCB's losses, fund failing projects, and quietly fill the financial black hole Miss Lan had created. And with that, the blueprint for one of Vietnam's biggest investment scams was born. They chose 4 companies inside the Vantin Phat Group to act as the face of the operation. These companies were tasked with issuing, promoting, and illegally selling private corporate bonds. On paper, the bonds looked like legitimate investments. They were marketed as a chance to earn returns from safe, profitable business projects. In reality, they were just pieces of paper backed by lies. The plan was to raise around $1.3 billion, not to build anything new, but to cover SCB's growing losses and keep money flowing into Miss Lan's personal accounts. But how do you make fake bonds look real? Simple. Step 1. Have other companies within Vantin Phat Group act as the first buyers. These companies bought the bonds issued by the 4 chosen firms. This created the illusion that real business interest existed. Step 2. Pass the bonds around. At least 5 companies inside the group started buying, selling, and transferring bonds back and forth, purely on paper. This made it seem like the bonds were in high demand, and that they were being actively traded. Step 3. Once everything looked legitimate, the bonds were passed to a broker who began selling them to the public. Over 35,000 investors fell for it. People from all walks of life. Retirees, professionals, families saving for the future, trusted the paperwork, the names, and the promise of profit. They put their faith and their life savings into what they believed was a solid investment. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Miss Lan had everything set up to look clean. Fake documents were created. Transactions were routed through SCB to give everything a layer of legitimacy. And after collecting over 1.3 billion US dollars, the funds were quickly split up. A portion was withdrawn in cash directly from SCB, another portion was used to repay old loans. The rest was used to support Miss Lan's personal lifestyle. In the end, the companies behind the bonds had no real revenue, no ability to pay back the money, and when the time came, they defaulted. Thousands of investors were left with nothing. The bonds were worthless, the money was gone, and the system they believed in had betrayed them. But justice always finds a way. Miss Lan's story was nearing its end, but the ending was unexpected, even for the greatest skeptics. By 2016, the government of Vietnam had had enough. The Communist Party launched a major anti-corruption campaign called the Blazing Furnace. The goal was simple: clean up the country no matter who got burned. And it worked. The campaign was one of the biggest in Vietnam's history. It led to the resignation of 2 presidents, the firing of many high-ranking officials, and the arrest of thousands of people. But the crackdown didn't include just politicians. Business leaders were hit too. Some of the most powerful businessmen in Vietnam, CEOs of large companies, and even banks were arrested for things like fraud, manipulating the stock market, and other financial crimes. No one was safe. And among the names being investigated was Miss Lan. For years, she had stayed in the shadows, building her empire and keeping her secrets hidden. But now the heat was turning toward her. On October 8, 2022, everything came crashing down. Miss Lan, once one of the most powerful businesswomen in Vietnam, was officially prosecuted and arrested by the police. The news shocked the country. For years, she had operated in the shadows, owning a bank, moving billions, and controlling a massive empire built on fraud. But now, the law had finally caught up with her, and the case was massive. The scale of the investigation was unbelievable. 2,500 sets of documents, weighing a total of 6 tons, containing over 1 million individual records. It was one of the largest financial crime cases in the history of the world. Miss Lan was charged with a long list of serious crimes: embezzlement, bribery, violating lending rules in the banking system, fraudulent appropriation of property, money laundering, illegal transportation of money across borders. The trial was immense and emotional. The evidence was overwhelming, and the damage she caused was now clear to everyone. The court demanded that Miss Lan and her family pay back the stolen money. To do that, they were ordered to liquidate over 1,100 assets, including some of her most valuable properties, like Saigon 1 Tower and Saigon Peninsula. Even her husband, Eric Chu, got involved. He sold $1 billion worth of assets in Hong Kong in an attempt to cover some of the financial losses. But Miss Lan never admitted guilt. Throughout the entire trial, she denied the accusations, saying she was misunderstood and unfairly judged. She claimed she was hurt by being seen as dishonest, and said others were to blame: her employees, her subordinates, anyone but herself. But the evidence was too strong. The numbers didn't lie. And after more than a month of hearings, the verdict came down. The Ho Chi Minh City People's Court sentenced Miss Lan to death. It was a shocking end to one of the most powerful and mysterious figures in Vietnam's financial world. An empire built over decades collapsed in handcuffs. She moved in silence and stole billions. For years, she lived above the law, shielded by power and money. But justice has a long memory, and it finally caught up with her. In the end, Miss Lan paid the ultimate price for everything she took. Not in dollars, not in prison time, but with her life.